Yo, what's going on, dudes? Hopefully everyone is doing okay. So welcome back to the channel. This is going to be a short video on braking. I was actually asked recently by one of my subscribers if I could do a video on brakes, because I think they said that their bike didn't have independent brakes like what this bike does. So I thought, you know what, let's make a short video on that, go over it. Now, there are advanced braking techniques that you can use. I'm not going to talk about them purely because this is based at people who are learning to ride, you know, mod 2 stuff. If you're learning your mod 1, you'll also go over this stuff with your instructor, because you have things like the slalom, you have figure of 8, and of course the emergency stop. All of them involve brakes, especially the emergency stop, but the slalom, figure of 8, U-turn, you can use a bit of braking in that. We'll go over that shortly. So most motorbikes, when you're learning to ride, have two different types of brakes. You have a front brake and you have a back brake, and they can be used independently. They have their own purpose, or they can be used at the same time. But there are things that you should do and things that you shouldn't do when it comes to braking. So the first thing to remember is whenever you're braking, no matter what kind of braking it is you're doing, you should always do it in a straight line. Do it when you're in a straight line, and do it while your bike's upright. So if you're approaching a corner, you want to get all of your braking done and you want to get your speed down before you initiate the turn, okay? You don't want to be braking going round a corner. So that's the first thing you need to know. Make sure that braking is done when the bike's nice and straight and upright. So don't use brakes going round a corner. You can get yourself into a very tricky situation. So you've got your front brake, which is the right hand lever, and you've got your rear brake, which is the pedal under your right foot. And the thing you have to remember is that the front brake is your main brake, alright? That's the brake that you're going to use most of the time. There's going to be a lot of times when you're going to be using the back brake. I personally use the back brake quite a lot, but the front brake is the more powerful of the two. And there's a little technique that you use with the front brake to make sure that you're not squeezing it. Because if you think about it, I think we've all done it as kids. If you're on your mountain bike or whatever, and you pull on the front brake and you go whoop, you go over the handlebars. I think that kind of sticks with you a wee bit. And then the first time you get on a motorbike, it's like, oh my god, you know, how much pressure do I use? And that's where you use a technique called progressive braking. It's basically slowly pulling on the brake rather than squeezing it. You know, you don't want to be doing that. You want to slowly pull the brake on. So that's called progressive braking, alright? So it's just a case of learning not to squeeze it. If you squeeze it really fast and really hard, there's a good chance the front wheel's going to lock up and skid. If you did that on your mod 1, you're going to fail. If you skid or lock up any of the wheels in your mod 1, it's an instant failure. You'll just be asked to leave the test area and go and park the bike up. So that's why learning to do things like progressive braking is essential. And that counts for the back brake as well. Even though the back brake isn't quite as strong as the front brake, if you put enough pressure on it, it will lock the rear wheel. I know this is kind of a weird way to think about it. This is the way I thought about it when I was learning to ride on my CBT. If you think of like a kid, a toddler, baby, whatever, they've got to learn those fine motor skills, you know, grabbing things, you know, switching things between hands, etc. And if you think about it, I guarantee the first time like a baby grabs a banana, it's going to end up an absolute mush in their hands, isn't it? You know, because they don't know the correct way to grip it. They don't know how much pressure has to get used, and they use too much and it goes and that's it. You've got a squash banana. But over time, as they get better, as they eat their bananas more and, you know, do that skill and develop it, they don't squish the banana, alright? So if you were to go like that, really tight, the back wheel's going to lock. But what you're doing is you're slowly pulling on the brake. So your front brake, like I said, is going to be your main brake, alright? That's the one you're going to use the most of. The main purpose for it is stripping down speed. You know, if you're travelling in a national speed limit road doing 60 miles an hour, and then you come into a town which is a 30 mile an hour speed limit, you'd use that front brake and that would strip off most of the speed. Now you can use both brakes together, that is absolutely fine, but if you do use both brakes together, there is a way you're supposed to do it. So you would use the front brake first, doing that progressive braking technique, slowly pulling on the front brake, and then once you've initiated the front brake, then you can put on the back brake. So front brake and then back brake, and that will slow the bike down just a bit quicker. So if you've done your Mod 1 or you're training for your Mod 1, or even if you're thinking about going in for your Mod 1, you're going to be doing a lot of slow manoeuvre stuff, because that's what the Mod 1 is. There are going to be times where you're going to be using the front brake because you have to do things like the emergency stop, you have to do the hazard avoidance, all that sort of stuff, and obviously you're stopping the bike from about 30 miles an hour or so, so you're going to be using the front brake. But there are manoeuvres where you're going to be moving slowly, like maybe 5 or 6 miles an hour maybe, figure of 8, slalom, U-turn, those sort of things. You do not want to be using the front brake during those manoeuvres, alright? Because at that speed, turning the bike, you will upset the balance of the bike. Well, you could, you know, you could. If you're very, very gentle, it might be okay, but don't do it. Use the back brake. You might not even need to use the back brake, to be absolutely honest, but if you feel you're going that little bit quick while doing these manoeuvres, just feather on the back brake, you know, just very, very lightly using it, can slow the bike down, and it just makes it a bit easier to control, alright? Because the bike's not out of balance, you're using the back brake, and it just makes it easier to control, along with obviously your slow control clutch and throttle. So your back brake is for those finer movements, think about it that way. For those finer movements where you just need a little bit of subtle braking, that's when the back brake comes into play. The one little tip for you, if you're doing your Mod 1, you're going to get an emergency stop, and like we were talking about earlier on, if you were to lock any of your wheels, it will be an instant fail, okay? And that's where people can get caught out, because they're not using progressive braking, they're just grabbing the lever, grabbing the brakes and hoping that the bike's going to stop. And yeah, it'll stop, but the good chance is you're going to skid, you're going to lock up the rear wheel and it's going to skid and you're going to fail. Alright, so using that progressive braking during your emergency stop is absolutely key. Another person who doesn't know how to use indicators, my god. Alright, so that's what the progressive braking is. Rather than going onto the brakes, you're going onto the brakes. Alright, it's a nice slow gradual pressure that you're applying. With the emergency stop, you can definitely do it with just the front brake. I used both on mine, but I did do progressive braking on both the front and the back brake. So when the examiner said, you know, or raised his hand I should say, it was progressive onto the front and then onto the back, both applying gradual pressure, which brought the bike to a nice controlled stop. If I'd been travelling at 30 miles an hour whatever and just went whoop right onto the front brake or on the back brake, it's going to go skid and you're going to have to retake your Mod 1. So you can use both together, whether it's emergency stop, whether it's just slowing down for a roundabout or whatever, but just make sure that the front goes first, then it's the back, and it's all about how you apply the pressure. Now if you've ever done any sort of research on braking, I did a lot while we were on lockdown, while I was waiting to sit my Mod 2, and you know, I'd try it when I was out and about just to kind of see what it's like. I'm not talking about advanced techniques or anything, just, you know, like beginner stuff. And you can use engine braking, you know, that's basically where you just let the engine of the bike gradually slow you down. You know, the clutch is still engaged and the engine is just naturally slowing the bike down. You can do that, that's absolutely fine. I did see some suggestions where people would only ride like that, they'd very rarely use the brakes, which is fine I suppose. I mean, you can absolutely do that, you know, if you're approaching a roundabout or a junction or whatever and you can see it's clear and the engine braking is enough to slow the bike down, you don't have to use the brakes, that's absolutely fine. The problem I have with that, it's like anything, if you don't use it you lose it, and brakes is exactly the same. If you don't use the brakes, over time you're going to lose that skill that you've built up of using the brakes, that whole progressive braking, how much force to apply. So I mean, it's entirely up to you if you want to ride like that. I personally don't ride like that. I think it's good to use the brakes, keep on top of them, and yeah, there's going to be situations where you don't need them and that's absolutely fine, but don't go into the habit of purposely not using them, you know, because I think that you will get a wee bit rusty. And one thing you have to absolutely make sure that you're practicing, I know a lot of people don't like to do it, I was the same when I first started riding, and it's to go out in the wet. Just go out in the wet, don't go crazy, you know, don't go flying round a bend like what you normally would in the dry, because it's, you know, it's a completely different situation. So you'd have to make sure that your braking points are double what they would be on a dry day. It might not be that, but for safety reasons, start off at double until you get used to braking in the wet. And it's definitely a good thing to learn, because you just never know when you're going to get caught out in the rain, you know. And if you've never practiced it and you don't think, oh wait a minute, my braking distance is going to be longer, I'm going to have to brake earlier, and you don't think about that and you're braking like what you would do on a dry day, you're going to get yourself in a sticky situation. So go out on a wet day. I don't mean like a monsoon, don't go out if it's absolutely pouring down, you know. Go out once it's rained. Just take your time, you know. You don't have to crank it open and overtake everything on the road, or even if you're on a wee 125, you know, just toddle around your little town, just go along roads that you know, go around corners that you know, and then think to yourself, right, that's normally where I would brake, I need to brake earlier than that. But once you get used to it, you kind of go to yourself, right, I would normally brake at that white car, but because it's wet, I'm going to brake where the grey car is. Alright, so see how different that is? You know, that's just an example, that's not set in stone, but that's just an example of, you know, how much further back you have to brake on a wet day. For such a simple thing, you know, oh, it's just stopping the bike. It's actually a little bit more in depth than that. You know, there's things you've got to think about. Terrain that I'm on, you know, what's the road like? Is there any gravel on the road? Is there any dirt? Is the road dry? Is it wet? You've got all these things to think about. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to our old stomping ground, down to that wee industrial estate, and we'll go over some of the situations when you'd use the back brake. So your back brake is used primarily when you're going slow, you know. You can use it together with the front brake to slow down quicker, but if you're just dottering about the town or whatever and you're in slow moving traffic, or you're going to be doing U-turns, slalom, figure of eight, that sort of stuff in your mod 1s, your back brake, you would use that during them. Alright, so if you're just going about in the town and you're in traffic and you're just kind of, you know, slowly moving, you can use the back brake. I mean, you can use the front brake if you want, I occasionally do, but if I'm just sitting at a nice steady, maybe 3 or 4 miles an hour cruising in traffic, I'll use the back brake because it's absolutely fine, keeps the bike nice and balanced, you know. That's just the way I use it. And so, for instance, if we were doing a U-turn here and we found that the bike was getting away from us a little bit, obviously clutch control is key for that sort of stuff, but using the back brake, it's just for those finer movements. It just helps smooth things out, you know. It just keeps the bike nice and steady. Now, I'm not doing proper U-turns here, I'm just, you know, just turning the bike around, but at the moment all I'm doing is I've got a constant throttle, constant clutch engaged, and my back brake is just engaged slightly, you know, just slightly, and we're just moving about. Alright, so having that back brake, it just makes so much difference. So you hear it, I've still got, it's still a wee bit squeaky there. So it's something, once you practice, you'll go, oh my god, that makes so much more sense. It's hard to take it on board when you're not physically doing it. You know, if you're not physically doing it, it's a little bit more difficult to understand. But once you've physically doing it, it's so much easier. Feathering the back brake, I'm just making sure that I'm not letting the bike run away from me. That's about all there is to it. You just need to put it into practice, you know. If you're in a position where you've done your CBT and you've got a 125, find somewhere like this, go over it. See, just now I'm using the back brake, no need to use the front brake. And even just coming along here just now, slowing down for this, you can totally use the back brake as well. Because we're moving nice and slow, you know, you don't have to have any heavy braking, there's no heavy braking needed, but just travelling around, nice slow speeds. Hear my back brake? I mean, in theory, if you've got good clutch control and good slow control, you shouldn't really need the back brake, but sometimes it's needed just to kind of keep things smooth. And if you don't have a 125 to train on and you have to rely on going out with your instructor, if you're feeling that, you know, you just don't have the confidence to kind of go a wee bit faster and then put the brakes on or whatever, or even just the slow manoeuvre stuff, just say to your instructor, look, I need to spend, even if you spend a lesson, spend an hour, you'd be surprised how much an hour can make. You know, just having that extra practice, you know, it makes so much more difference. And then once you get the technique, once you get it down and it's in your brain and you know how to do it, you know, it's just a case of keeping on top of it. You know, because if you keep on top of it, and then you're not going to let that skill get rusty, like what we were talking about earlier on. Like everything else, it just takes practice. It takes practice. The number one thing to remember is take it easy. You know, don't go grabbing things. You know, grabbing things and squeezing as hard as you can, because you're going to put yourself in a very dodgy situation. You know, you can grab your brake really, really hard. That's absolutely fine, but before you get to that, you need to grab it very lightly first, you know, and that's where that progressive braking comes into play. So the main things to remember are always brake in a straight line when the bike's nice and upright. Don't brake going round corners. Make sure that all that speed is stripped off before you initiate the turn. Front brake is used mainly for stripping off speed. Back brake is for the slow manoeuvre stuff, or the more kind of finer movements. But of course you can use them together to strip off speed a little bit quicker if you need to. And remember, if you're riding in the wet, it is completely different to riding in the dry. You know, you have to be very, very gentle on those brakes. You know, get used to it, build up that skill level of riding in the wet, and then all you have to do is just practice what you've learnt and go over it and keep going over it. And then eventually braking will become second nature, and you'll be using the front brake and back brakes without even thinking about it. So like everything else in learning to ride a bike, it is a skill. It's not just a case of jump on the bike and pull a lever. You know, there is a certain finesse about it. So give it a go, have a wee practice. Remember that progressive braking. Sit on the bike before you move off and just get used to slowly squeezing the brake. Just get used to that feeling, because obviously everybody's brake lever is going to be different. You know, some might be stiffer than others, some might be, you know, really kind of squishy, which if it is, you might need to get that looked at. Make sure you're looking ahead so that if you do have to brake, you're not having to slam on the brakes to do emergency stop. You can put that progressive braking into practice and slow the bike down in plenty of time, you know. So you're watching these lights up here, they've been green for a while. They won't change because there's no pedestrians there. But if you saw a pedestrian standing there, you know, you go, right, they might change. There's no much point hammering through it, and then at the last second it changes and you've got to go whoop, slam on the brakes. You know, that's not good enough, you're not paying attention. You need to be way back there and going, there's the lights, I might have to stop. Alright? See, like this guy there? Perfect example. I'm just cutting off the power a wee bit, just watching what he's doing, and then back on. Alright? So you're just making sure that you spot anything that could cause you to brake. Anything that causes you to brake is a hazard. That's it, it's a hazard. And you have to react and you have to brake. And the earlier you spot it, the easier it's going to be on you and on the bike. So I know there's quite a lot there to take in, you know, but the fundamentals are fairly straightforward. It's just getting into practice, you know, just getting into practice and just making sure that you're being nice and easy, especially on that front brake. But I think we're approaching the end of the Mod 2 series. I think I've covered most of it. There might be a few things that we need to kind of go over, but what I might do is, for the last episode in the series, I might do like a top tip sort of thing, and then we'll be moving on. So I've got a few more plans for the channel. Now that things are starting to open up a wee bit, we can travel almost anywhere we want within the UK. I think I'm going to be starting doing a few kind of adventure trips. Nothing major, I'm not like talking like travelling to the top of Scotland or whatever, just kind of taking you around the central Scotland area, showing you the sights, get the drone out, get some cool footage. I think that'll be interesting. But anyway dudes, hopefully you've enjoyed this, hopefully you found it helpful. If there is anything you're stuck on regarding braking, or anything regarding the Mod 1 or 2, please feel free to get in touch. I'm loving the fact that you guys are getting in touch, sending me comments, sending me messages, and even better, you guys are sending me updates of when you pass your Mod 2s, which is so good to see, dudes. That is so good. So congrats to everybody that's passing. It really is good to see more people getting on two wheels, getting their licenses and getting out on the road. But anyway dudes, hopefully you've enjoyed this. If you have dudes, give it the thumbs up. I really do appreciate every single one of your likes, and of course if you want to see all of my uploads, click on that subscribe button and ring the bell while you're there. That way you'll get notified every time I upload a video. But until next time guys, stay safe, ride safe and take it easy.